Yes, we can hear all the planning. That's good, Dairita.
Oh, well, so she could hear all the chit chat.
Yes, yes.
Okay, Rupali, we are live now on YouTube, and you can go ahead with your
Okay,
introduction.
great. So thank you, everyone. I'm not going to say good evening because people are from all over the place and all over the world. Let me introduce myself. I'm professor at the School of Environment and Architecture. My name is Rupali Gupte. I'm also one of the co-founders of the school. The school is called the School of Environment and Architecture, but short as SEA, which is we like to call it's a poetic abbreviation, which I think is also appropriate for this particular lecture, which is on Bangladesh, and where and we all know how deep the hydrological relationship of architecture is in Bangladesh. So I welcome you to this third lecture on this in the series of South Asian landscapes. This is part of the Sea Conversations, a fortnightly lecture series that we've been having since 2014. We've had more than 100 talks in this series. This is also partly supported by the Urban Design Research Institute that has been consistently supporting this initiative. And I think, I mean, to sort of introduce this, the series, I think one of the things that is important for us to shift to the frame of thinking of the region, which we think is extremely important right now, that sort of shifts us from the parochial frames of nationalisms that the climate of the world is sort of leading to these days. The South Asian region particularly is important in the way it sort of shares geographies, shares histories, but also very important in the way it shares cultural practices, not only historically, but also for the present. At Sea, we started this particular initiative looking at South Asian architecture 3 years ago as part of the pedagogical agenda, because we realized that we really didn't have enough material to teach South Asian architecture with. And so we've instituted a vertical. We have one research associate every year that works on this. And it's a kind of three-pronged agenda. One is to sort of conceptualize new frameworks to understand South Asian architecture through. The second is to build this robust archive to work with. And third is really to make friends in the region with whom we can really sort of work with this conceptualization. Particularly in this contemporary moment, which is in flux. And we believe that it's almost impossible to think of contemporary architecture by ourselves. It's really collective intelligence that will drive us to sort of, thinking of the present moment. And who else then for us to invite but Professor Kazi Ashraf, who has been one of the tallest figures in history and theory in the region. I'm going to read out his bio here because it's also kind of a rather accomplished bio. Professor Kazi Ashraf is an architect and architectural historian trained at MIT and at the University of Pennsylvania. Having taught at the University of Pennsylvania, University of Hawaii, Temple University, and Pratt Institute in the US, he currently heads the Bengal Institute for Architecture, Landscape, and Settlements in Dhaka, Bangladesh. The institute is engaged in researching and envisioning urban futures for Bangladesh that integrate urbanism, landscape, and hydrology. Ashraf has authored, edited several books, amongst which are Locations, an Anthology of Architecture and Urbanism, The Hermit's Hut, Architecture and Asceticism in India, Designing Dhaka, a Manifesto for a Better City, and of course, many others. And I think I would really love, this is very interesting that we are inviting Professor Ashraf here, particularly because Bangladesh has been sort of at the forefront of, producing some of the cutting edge, contemporary architecture. And, as we mentioned earlier, has deep sort of relationships to hydrology and the region. But I think, this is the conversation that we had when we invited him. We wanted him to sort of look at, a broad spectrum of sort of what is happening in Bangladesh. But I think what he was more interested in is looking at the contemporary moment, and I think that's what Bangladesh is, the Bengal Institute is also trying to do. Also trying to shift its kind of focus from looking at, this idea of architecture in the region and its relationship to the landscape, to starting to look at the idea of the city as well, right? If I'm not mistaken. So I think with that, I would like to invite Professor Kazi Ashraf to deliver his talk. One small sort of housekeeping here is, if you can leave your questions in the Q&A instead of the chat, that will be very useful to streamline some of the questions. I invite you, Professor Ashraf, to speak here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupali. Thank you especially for inviting me to this talk, to you and C, on architecture in Bangladesh. Yeah, as you know, I've been two-minded about giving an online talk because, I'm not quite sure about this disembodied relationship. It really feels like I'm talking to myself and one is not sure where that is going. But I will try. But first of all, I would like to say something, which is, I really like the name C, the School of Environment and Architecture. It reminds me that I was talking to some friends in Mumbai, architects who are invested in Mumbai. And we were jokingly saying that we might do a studio between Mumbai and Dhaka, and we'll call it MUD, M-U-D, MU Mumbai and Dhaka. Perhaps you might want to think about that also, like there are various ways we can consider or think about the waters, which is perhaps the basis of what I'm going to talk about today. I really like your emphasis on collective intelligence, especially as it comes to South Asian architecture. And maybe a little bit of my talk will reflect on that and also pull up some historical moments where this thing has happened before. And I think many of us may not remember that, how a discourse on South Asian architecture was generated in Dhaka, and then it kind of overflowed into other places in South Asia, and something to think about. Well, how to talk about architecture in Bangladesh?
Sorry, Professor Kazi Ashraf, you will have to share your screen, if you can share your screen now.
Okay, sure, yes. Let me go to my screen. Okay. So I have a full screen. Let me check this. Okay, it's not going forward. Yes,
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, no, it wasn't going forward. Okay, I wanted to begin by thinking about like how to talk about architecture in Bangladesh. You're right, Rupali, when you mentioned that recently a whole array of architectural work has been highlighted internationally, very strong, robust work. You mentioned cutting edge, we'll see how cutting edge that is. But this is an older story. When you think about architecture in Bangladesh, you want to know whether it's about really tectonic formations. Is it about spiritual motives? Is it about corporate real estate values, new landscape modulations? Or is it about humanistic modernity, functional regionalism, transnational values, all of those? Or is it really about the waters in the delta? That's something I want to think about. So my presentation is in two parts. Quickly, I want to give a summary of architecture in Bangladesh, so things are placed in context. But really, I want to talk about challenges. I'm more interested in challenges and how these challenges can spawn new motivations in architecture. And these challenges may spring from Bangladesh, but I would like to argue these challenges have wider relevance. So what I'm showing you here is, again, this sort of array of architecture works. Some are already very well known, but coming from all the different sort of motivations that I've just mentioned before. I'd like to start with these two images. The one on the right is definitely well known, and one on the left is work from the 1960s by Mazharul Islam. With these two images, I have actually have done this talk before earlier last year in Goa, where I presented the work of these two masters, Mazharul Islam from Bangladesh and Louis Kahn, and I discussed this under the theme of contrapuntal modernism. Both emerge from the sort of the belly of modernism, but both have different kind of destinations. And it's interesting to see both simultaneously and side by side. So with these two work on the slide here, I want to say that Bangladesh played a critical role in the history of mid-modern architecture. And it's a poorly narrated story except for Louis Kahn. You have Mazhar Islam on the one hand and Louis Kahn on the other. With Mazhar Islam, it relates to a more fundamental story about the bungalow, an architectural idea that emerged from the Bengal region, which was adopted by the English, and that became, as we all know, a global paradigm of dwelling. But I'm not talking about the bungalow per se, but what I want to think about is how that simple rural hut generated a techno-utilitarian aspect in architecture, which subsequently informed what is known as tropical architecture. And this whole matrix of comfort and well-being, which one could argue becomes the cornerstone of what we call sustainability today in one way or another. A big strand of Mazhar Islam's work is about that. And here you can see the two figures, Mazhar Islam and Louis Kahn. And Louis Kahn, on the other hand, brought out another aspect which was lying kind of dormant in the sort of the mainstream modern architectural thinking and practices. Number one, the whole question of symbolism, sacredness, sacred experiences, or whatever you want to call it, and the landscape modulation as a fundamental aspect of architecture. So you have this sort of two things going on simultaneously. I find these two images quite kind of telling. They are totally coincidental. You have Mazhar Islam looking horizontally and Louis Kahn looking vertically, and the two images are not related, but all of a sudden it kind of makes sense for me, and I'll discuss this as I go on. I have argued this before. I want to talk about Bengali modernism, and I've argued this before, and I've written about it also, but I'll just say a few things to make sense for today's talk, that architectural modernism might have begun in Bangladesh with Mazhar Islam in the 1950s, singularly, but modernity has a long lineage and a deep strata in Bengal. For Mazhar Islam, a very fundamental question was, how do we enter the 21st century? He used to say that repeatedly to make us wonder about our own position, because it's a reflection on we, the idea of the nation, on the political and economic nature of society, and its spatial manifestation. In that question, there is also a degree of hesitation about propelling forward and also glancing back. So with Mazhar Islam, of course, he was doing this kind of very, I would say, robust work in the 1950s and 60s. But fundamentally, his query was about what to hold on to, what to abandon, and what to take. And you'll realize this is the dilemma of modernity. The idea of modernity in Bangladesh is related to the cultural and intellectual, the upheavals ushered in Bengal by the 19th century movement, which is often known as the Bengal Renaissance. I show this work by Tagore. I'm sure many of you know. What I want to emphasize is that this whole dilemma of modernity, what to abandon and what to take, is taken up in the from the 19th century onwards in Bengal, and then it spills over to the broader region in Bangladesh, definitely. in literary and, and very soon in others, and artistic circles. The movement, the Bengal Renaissance movement, if you want to call it that, is the basis of modern Bengali society. It's a complex intertwining of acceptance and resistance. It's a resistance to both the traumatic experience of colonialism, but also it's a resistance to the tyranny of tradition. I've argued that before. And the condition of acceptance, what to accept, was also twofold, but also complex, because it involved, first of all, an inward voyage. An outward voyage to embrace from a global repository anything that assured new degree of social and intellectual liberation. That's on the one hand. And also an inward journey, which involved a conscious sort of excavation of one's own cultural strata. Now, this inward journey, I'm showing you this, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with that, but it's a very important, interesting fact, which has not been quite discussed in architectural circles yet. How in 1922 in Calcutta, the Bengal Society of Art, the group that you see on the right, organized an exhibition of the work of famous artists from the Bauhaus circle in Calcutta, especially organized by Stella Kramrisch. So you can see that Calcutta definitely was sort of at the heart of this sort of both, you can call it an upheaval, but definitely a major cultural or reorganization of things. So I mentioned the inward journey. There's the outward journey, and then the inward journey. But the inward journey, to put it simply, involves an understanding of oneself. Simply said, but this is an important issue because this understanding of oneself means self-awareness. Now, self-awareness is double-edged. It's a moment of self-discovery, but it is also a moment of distancing one from the familiar. These works were also coming out a little later, I would say, 60s and 70s. So the repository of architectural works of Bengal was beginning to be known. I cite this as an example, Tagore's story, Satyajit Ray's film, Charulata, as one example, which represents to me the whole turmoil of this inward journey. The main characters, if you recall, from two films, Charulata and Bimala, characters from two Tagore novels, signify at the moment of self-awareness, the familiar is made foreign. Or conversely, one is made stranger to the comfort of familiar setting. But yes, it is within this condition of self-awareness where tradition is no longer available as simply as before, that the idea of identity, whether it's cultural, national, can arise. I've mentioned this before, but I just wanted to say this. Why? Because this whole thing is a paradox. And this is the paradox that leads to the juncture of architecture and nation building. And again, some of these narratives are taken up much more provocatively and powerfully in literary and cinematic medium, as again in the world of Opu, where this movement from the village to the city, and you can see these two in juxtaposition, makes for this powerful moment of paradox. But back to Mazhar Islam. It is Mazhar Islam's work which is at the heart of the question of nation building, the practice of nation building via architecture in Bangladesh since the 50s onwards, within the context of what I just had mentioned before, because 50s and prior to this 1940s, Mazhar Islam emerges from that intellectual and cultural matrix. Mazhar Islam, well, who was Mazhar Islam? He was, of course, this brilliant architect who at the age of 30 designed this building. in Dhaka, the College of Arts and Crafts, and by this single building. And then there was another building, the public library. Through these two buildings, he was able to convey totally a new, fresh medium of architectural language. He was a brilliant architect. He was I would call he did not teach formally in any universities or schools, but he was a radical teacher. His atelier was more like a school. He was an activist, and he was a political ideologue. He was all along committed to leftist ideology, and he was since the late 1960s, which led to the independence of Bangladesh from Pakistan, and afterwards he was directly involved in political activism. The early modern architecture of Bangladesh, and I'll go quickly here, of someone like Mazharul Islam, was framed primarily by, I would say, ecological themes or meteorological themes that is relevant, befitting the topics of the tropics. And also it was a kind of utilitarian ethic that coincided with post-colonial nation building. If you like, it doesn't look like that way, but it's Gandhian. It's very sparse and it's very reductive. His later works, it kind of moves, if you like, if you see the works from the left to the right, from a very skeletal framework-like architecture, very porous, it becomes more ponderous brick buildings, and his later works definitely represent that language. I want to highlight this. Some of your listeners may know this. A group that was founded in Dhaka in 1983. It started a little earlier, but this is the manifesto that was published. It started as a study group, but it became the Chetana Architecture Research Society, founded by Mazharul Islam in the context of a critique of the intellectual and cultural condition in Bangladesh at that time. But it had a very powerful presence amongst architects. All the architects or the works that I had shown earlier in the first slide, in one way or another, would be indebted to the activities of Chetana, and they may they may say it themselves. What is also important, Chetana brought out a very strong discourse in architecture, not only via buildings. Of course, building is primary in architecture, but other modes of practices in architecture, books, for example, conferences, which now seems rather obvious, but again, in the 80s, early 80s, organizing these things required a certain kind of strong motivation. But yes, the literary discourse of architecture was a strong element. In fact, maybe I would like to claim here that I inherited that aspect. This image is historically important. You can see that Chetana organized a major symposium or seminar on architecture, design and education in 1987. And Doshi was invited, Anand Raje, Satish Gujral, and a few other people to Dhaka. First time they visited Dhaka. But what it did was it inaugurated a new relationship between Bangladesh and India, at least. And then there was architects from Pakistan, Kamil Khan Mumtaz, and others also joined. So Rupali, this is what I meant by the historical sort of moment of a major discourse among South Asian architects, which went on for quite a few years, and it developed into a number of other sort of localized activities in different cities of India and Bangladesh. But I think it didn't go on to do something very formal. But I think that relationships among many of the architects who are still around, that's still active. Okay, and then coming back to Louis Kahn, the work is very well known, of course, to all of you. And I'm not going to go into details. And yes, of course, I have written about this project in many places. What I want to highlight again, a few things that is important. Khan's work in Dhaka played a key role in the evolution of modernism towards what I would like to call humanistic dimensions. His engagement with the taboo topics of modernism, which in the mainstream modernism wasn't discussed in a very foregrounded way. One is landscape and geography, and second, spirituality and sacrality. Khan, I would say, brought that out in the most profound and powerful way. So it's not the, the strong geometric Platonic shapes, the metaphysical aspect of his buildings. I'm not going into that, but there's two aspects, landscape and geography, spirituality and sacrality. They found inspiration and a reciprocal significance in Bangladesh. And these themes then become, at least for me, a very powerful moment. So it's not just the robust both and the sort of the Piranesian spaces inside the building, but I'm more, I have always been intrigued by something like this. This is a site model from 1963, made in clay. The whole aspect of how the landscape may have gathered together and coagulated into these architectural forms. And if you have visited Dhaka and if you go to Dhaka, when you see the complex, you will not see Khan's buildings in isolation, definitely. You will see it in a very particular not only the city, but this particular landscape. And I am more interested, I've always been interested not in the building by itself, but the building in relationship to other buildings. And I see this complex as an ensemble of buildings, parks, gardens, waters, channels, lakes. And this is how I would emphasize understanding Wisdom. Okay. And coming back to what I had mentioned earlier, the aspect of Mazharul Islam's ecological ethic, and I would like to explore that a little bit. Sometime in the 80s, I discovered this miniature painting. It's called the Bangala Ragini. It's a wonderful miniature painting which seems to condense and represent, this sort of meteorological environment of the Bengal Delta. You have this yogi sitting in a pavilion, which is a little elaborate pavilion, but you can see that it's just a very basic structure with columns and the roof. Perhaps the roof is a little domical, but let's say it's just a roof elevated from the ground. But what is more important is, if you notice carefully, if you can see it here, is the environment. The trees, the plants, the water lilies, the birds. Maybe if you look very closely, you can see bugs and insects also, the kind of things that we'll find in moist, humid tropics. But what is also important, you see the dark black clouds, the coming of the rain. I think it's a wonderful image of this pavilion. And the meaning of the pavilion, not as just an isolated little thing, which by itself is rather straightforward and simple, but it gets its meaning from this situation. And this led me to think about that perhaps in Bengal or in Bangladesh, this kind of hut type, the Bangla, from where you have the Bangladar and the bungalow, is a primal pavilion, a machine for living in a hot, humid milieu. This was crucial in developing this climatic ethic in architecture. And it's, as I was saying, it's very simple. In this case, there are no walls or no enclosures, but if there were enclosures, it would be permeable. The pavilion makes the distinction between exterior and interior totally ambiguous. In this case, there is no distinction. It's completely, as I say, it's completely with the atmosphere. And this creates a kind of centrifugal nature of the pavilion structure, meaning it's located, and as I was saying, its meaning is derived from its origin in the milieu. So to be with the atmosphere translates into a continuum of the external, the so-called natural world and the architectural space, and establishing a visual, spatial, and sensorial porosity of architecture in nature. So this becomes an idealized image. I would like to think this is the paradigm of the pavilion type. Not in a literal sense. What I'm trying to argue, and I've argued, is that in the Bengali environmental context, all buildings should be conceptually a pavilion. And from then on, analogically, the pavilion model can perhaps become, can inform buildings in tighter, denser urban situations. This is another fantastic drawing by a very famous Bangladeshi painter, Kamrul Hassan. And this, I show this always whenever I can, because this is the only drawing that hung on the wall of Mazhar Islam's own office. And what I was mentioning about porosity or interpenetration between outside and inside, between nature and architecture. In this case, this is so powerfully and so beautifully depicted. You know, they blur the architectural elements, the people, the peacocks, the plants, and the arch. There is a total. This is the most, the beautiful interpenetration of all the elements together. So, and quickly to go through from the pavilion model or the Bangla, the rural hut, you have the bungalow and all its other aspects, which one day we can talk about. And then kind of a quick bungalow types from the rural to the semi-urban in Bangladesh, and then to their urban manifestations architecturally from the 1950s onwards in the works of Mazharul Islam himself, in the work of Paul Rudolph. And now to mention that Mazharul Islam was very much responsible, and he engineered or orchestrated inviting Louis Kahn, Paul Rudolph, Stanley Tigerman to work in Bangladesh. But beyond these three figures, there were other architects, Konstantin Doxiadis and Bob Bowie, who worked in Bangladesh in the 60s. Was a major moment of the exploration of this ecological ethics, as here in the work of Paul Rudolph for an agricultural university in Mymensingh, and in the work of Bob Bowie on the left and Doxiadis on the right. And as you can see, of course, there is a sort of a relationship reference to Corbusier's work in this whole business of the parasol and the open space under the parasol, but they get modulated in different ways in these projects. But coming to a time more closer to us, 90s onwards, these are examples, two architects, perhaps of two generations, Bashirul Haq on the upper two frame, and Salahuddin Ahmed, who's going to be speaking soon on the lower frames, on again exploring the pavilion paradigm or the pavilion model in residential structures, the upper one in a rural context and the lower one in an urban context. Now, again, back to Mazhar Islam and the design of 5 polytechnic institutes in different locations in Bangladesh, again in the late 60s. Something that he did with the American architect Stanley Tigerman. Again, I'm not going into the details of this, the projects, but if you look at the right, the 5 sites and the arrangements of the different buildings, the sort of the type of typological buildings and their arrangements in different kind of modulations. What I've been also interested in how the pavilion paradigm becomes condition for the complex arrangement, the complex, the large scale ensemble of things. Maybe in this case, it's much more in an open sort of site and area, but then of course, you get into tighter urban situations, that's another challenge. But complex, and the Polytechnic Institute spawned a major study for Tigerman and Mazhar Islam. And then Mazhar Islam's later work in university outside Dhaka, Jahangirnagar University. So it's kind of, there are different essays on what I mentioned as complexes, and this is much more recent. But I want to say something about the design of complexes. I find this is a new area of investigation. You know, we find many examples of design of complexes. But I think theoretically, I don't know if we have looked into this very closely, other than maybe referring to what Charles Correa said. What you need in the climatic situation of India is disaggregation of forms instead of one monolithic form, as mainstream modernism would have taught us in the 40s, 50s. What you need is like splintering them off. The best example I can think of is the Crafts Museum in Delhi, from the monolithic singular form to the assembly or the ensemble. And Correa himself gives a beautiful climatic rationale to it, a place in the sun, because you're then moving from one to the other, from various kinds of enclosed, semi-enclosed, open to totally open spaces. And that's all a very beautiful experience. Now, then these clusters, if you like, from complex, you can call them clusters of pavilions, if you like, can be formed by lining them up or creating a series or grouping them around different kinds of interiorized or semi-interiorized spaces. In rural areas of the Bengal Delta, this can be the disposition of buildings in a fabric of paddy fields, gardens, orchards, lakes, and ponds. And perhaps this is what Saif Haq and Jalal Ahmed in the 1980s tried to achieve. This is another project by Saiful Haq. But I want to single out Saif's work here because he has been, and then from now on, I'll move on to more recent works. He has been particularly attentive. Let me go back to the previous slide. That he has been, and particularly attentive to the placing and grouping of buildings in a rural context. He is very sensitive to scale, form, siting, grouping, clustering. In fact, his complexes appear to be extension of the rambling village homes, but redefined in a disciplined architectural format. And this the new fabric is very intimately related to existing ponds and orchards. Can meander from one area to another through a variety of spatial experiences. But what is also important, the deliberately subdued nature of the architectural elements. And this whole modulation of, if you like, the form, the materials, the light and shadow, what have you, all, in his work give a sense of what I would call a belongingness, a feeling of having been there. With that, complexes, and then you have other architects, Kashif Mahbub Chaudhary, his recent work, Friendship Hospital, again, in a very sort of rural fabric. And this is one of our own work, which is ongoing, civic complex for a small town along a river. So which brings me to the second part of the discussion that I want to have with you is, what are the challenges for being an architect in Bangladesh? I would say three. To deal with water, to deal with the life world, and to deal with the city. Yes, architects have been active, they're doing powerful works, they're getting highlighted, and all for good reasons, but the bottom line is these three topics: water, life world, and the city. If architects in Bangladesh were to take on a distinctive challenge, it will be around the hydrogeographic theme that I mentioned. And because this theme is also very deeply connected to the future forms and cities and settlements in Bangladesh. So you have water on the one hand and the future forms and cities and settlements. I bring up again Khan's two sketches of Louis Khan, very interesting. One on the left is the first sketch Khan did when he came to Dhaka in 1963. He was taken on a boat ride and he also drew the riverbanks and boats on the envelope of the invitation for that, as you can see on the left, 1963. And then on the right is perhaps his last drawings for Dhaka, which is the huge area. On the very bottom, you can see the capital complex, but then you can see a large area which was given to him to think about housing or a kind of a new city. This was totally wetlands at that time. Now it is all filled up. And you can see those fingers going north and south. Khan was thinking of a very remarkable radical idea of sort of elevated dwellings, if you like, and the rest of the area left to, as it is, wetlands. Okay. While reflecting from the very beginning, while Khan was reflecting on his work in Bangladesh, you know, he brought up this his own way of thinking aloud that what is required to be an architect in Bangladesh. He suggested you need to be a land architect because in Bangladesh, all architectural actions require a modulation of the land, the clay, the muddy, the ground. And he talked about literally the whole dig and mound process that people do in villages. You dig up, scoop up the ground, and you pile it and elevate it, and you have your home. And then the dug up ground becomes a pond, and that's another sort of landscape paradigm. And he noticed that. But so Khan mentioned you have to be a land architect, which I now rephrase as in Bangladesh, you have to be a land water architect. So what Khan did not work out his ideas systematically, but I would like to think that what he was already saying, that architecture needs to be conditioned by the physics of the delta, the mutuality of land and water, the malleability of the ground, and the preciousness of dwelling on that kind of a landscape. And what I would like to show a few things here that we have done ourselves. Before you want to become an architect, what you need to do in Bangladesh is really understand the land water situation. On the left is a river, any river. I don't have to name a river in Bangladesh, any river, but it really behaves like that. It's totally meandering. One year the formation is like this, and next year, if you take a photograph of the same zone, you'll have a totally different situations. Banks would have been inundated, a new sand island may have evolved. So this is this fluctuating land water condition, where one moment land is water and another moment it's something else. This is the site. This is the site. And on the right is one of our geographer mapped this. You know, Dhaka city is situated right there somewhere in the lower half, which you have not shown, but these are the streamlines, the blue lines of the rivers, and then there are all the other sort of minor channels. And life exists in these streamlines. This is something to reckon with. And then if Bangladesh is a small country, but geographically with such fluctuations of land and water, you do get a whole array of landscape situations. Some stable, some not so stable, meaning that those formations may not exist for a long time. But it is within that context, architecture has to evolve. Again, I show this film because on the question of water, again, artists, and in this case, filmmaker has meditated on water and how the life world revolves, conditioned by such flux of water. Flux like this, amazing. And how a reversal can happen, which you can say it's a paradox, but yes, it is the paradox that conditions the landscape. And this is one particular site where, as you can see on the left, from water to the absence of water and things in between. And of course, the existence has been historically related to two primary occupations, rice cultivation and fishing, and everything beyond that, but that still remains primary mode of human occupation of the landscape, which is then represented in a very powerful way by artists like Sultan, or in other analogical ways by an Italian artist, Tarscito, who worked with craftsmen in Dhaka to conceive of situations like this. So I'm showing this because I want us to move away. If one wants to think about the flux of land water in the Bengal Delta, the idea of a fixed site, the idea of a fixed building, the idea of the stable, permanent situation that we typically think of architecture as then to be questioned. So I show some work which may refer to this condition of the flux of water, in this case, either directly or Raziullah-san, where simple landscape modulation allowed a whole rich experience of his project, which are really an ensemble of very simple buildings. Or again, in the case of Kashif Mahbub Chaudhary, which is a well-known project, a matted building complex, which was organized by creating a new embankment around it. And it allowed for a new landscape form to emerge. And then another architect who is more a landscape architect and a community architect, Khandakar Hasibul Kabir, a sketch for a retreat outside Dhaka. But how can you sketch that? This totally amorphous condition, but there's some photographs. And I showed this image because it may look, as I was saying earlier, it has always been there, that sort of condition. But everything here really, I may tell you that Kabir, if you like, organized. And then, of course, cyclone shelters and things like that, this is an unbuilt structure, but that allows for new ways of thinking about it. Yes, let us also not forget the harshness of the. And then another project, which is now fairly well known, Saiful Haq's Arcadia project, which won the Aga Khan Award. This is the project during construction. And again, this is a site which in conventional terms, any architect would have considered not a site. This is right next to a river, floods annually, totally unstable. There is no ground really. And how in a condition like that can you create a school or any structure? So what Saif proposed was a floating, literally floating, but fixed bamboo structure, very fragile, but then it works. It has been working as a school for little children in that area. But when you come to think about floating, of course, then there are floating schools, and then of course now there are floating hospitals and all that. That becomes obvious, and people have been doing that on their own. But architects like Mohammad Rezwan, he has a whole sort of social scheme for the training of students, little children and older folks on boats. So if you cannot come to school, the school will go to you. Well, that makes me think that in Bengal or in such a hydrological milieu, boats are buildings, right? I mean, look at that image. In fact, historically, in traditional contexts, the techniques that people may have used for making boats were also techniques for building. So there was a kind of a co-option of one by the other. But we have forgotten that. We meaning formally trained architects of this period, until a Frenchman comes along, Yves Mar, who is known for reviving the boat building traditions. Some of the boat builders, that craft has already died out or dying. He was able to revive that and do all these prototypes of these wonderful boats from Bangladesh, because in such a watery terrain, people invested in boats, and there are not one or two types of boats. Again, in a small country like Bangladesh, there are many types. And what Yves has been doing was a couple of things: revive boat building tradition, and also make new boats. But then there are, as I said, on a floating technology, on a vernacular floating technology, people not only build boats, but now you can see floating agriculture, floating farms, floating orchards. That can become cue for a new landscape form. The other thing I mentioned about challenges in architecture of the life world. By the life world, this is my second topic, for the challenges. And what do I mean by the life world? What I mean is simply our everyday where we lead our lives with architecture, but unthinkingly. I say this as a kind of opposition to metropolitan architecture, architecture which is deliberately architecture. But then there are conditions where we do things with architecture in a totally unthinking, natural way, if you like. This is a wonderful installation by Marina Tabassum at the 2018 Venice Biennale. She called it Wisdom of the Land. And what she did was organize elements, if you like, of a rural homestead. You can see that some are actual props and some are haunted images. So this is basically an ensemble of a household in a village household. And one needs to reflect on such moments of everydayness in a new way. And that relates to working with the community in Bangladesh, primarily with the rural communities, and a project that also garnered much attention and was very impactful was the METI school in Rudrapur by Anna Heringer and Ike Roswell. I'm sure many of you have seen that. The school itself, the community itself, school children were involved in the hand making of the school. I can't go into the detail now, but it's a wonderful story. And then, of course, back to Kabir, and many of the young architects were really interested in working in rural communities, again, not to make metropolitan architectural statements, but actually to work with communities. And what Kabir often has described as a cooperative design. And he has developed this whole technique of working with such rural and very poor communities. And as you can see on the left, where they are engaged in the conversation and they're involved in the building. And on the right is actually the making of a building, which has now become a very well-known model for housing for rural and poor communities. Another example from Kabir's housing is a process, definitely, for Kabir, more important than the form itself, because the form can be decided upon and generated by the builders. Okay, and then, of course, as I was mentioning, younger architects on the left and maybe other non-Bangladeshi architects working in the rural context. And at that level, what I mean, the everyday, there are again moments where architects have to get involved in things that are again not of that metropolitan stunning nature, but this requires working with the community. We did a couple of projects, a sanitizing station at this time. You can see on the left, and we're testing booth for COVID cases. These are things many architects in Bangladesh are involved in. I end with this image for this section, a beautiful image by Jalal Ahmed. He's also a well-known architect. He did this housing, rehousing for communities who live in shore areas, which are sand islands. They were displaced from their homes because of erosion and all that, and the erosion was controlled and new houses were made. And I love this because here the people are returning to their homes. And lastly, last section, if you want to talk about Bangladesh, how not talk about Dhaka. No narrative is complete without that. Dhaka, the poster child of, if you like, urban anarchy, name it, and you have it. But yet, okay, so this is these, if you like, the anarchic situation, but out of the anarchic situation, you can make something out of it. This is an installation at the last Seoul Biennale, which Salahuddin Ahmed designed the installation for us, Bengal Institute. We kind of recreated the sort of the gritty, the colorful, the messy urban alley of. But then this is also Dhaka. Dhaka is a deltaic city where water forms a very delicate nexus. This is from the, I think, 1988 or 89, during one of the high flood moments, which is also right now. You can see the central area of Dhaka, and then the blue is all the flooded area. At that time, I think 2/3 of the country was underwater, and a vast part of the city was underwater. But the problem is, this is the problem. Dhaka may be located in a powerful logical milieu, but it is undergoing a furious urbanization or planning practices that has totally succumbed to what I called the regime of dry ideology. And this is since the 1960s, a whole sort of new development ethos that was based on landfill, embankment, bridges, roadways, that supported the technology and the ideology of dry culture, which is like pushing the water away and the manufacture of dryness. So city meant the manufacture of dryness, the production of dryness. And this becomes the basis of the new city, of the new development ethos. But also this becomes the basis for an ecological and social crisis, which is undergoing. And I can't go into the detail of that, but what happens is then the Dhaka and the Delta are now two separate entities. They're antithetical and stranger to each other. There's a schism between dry and wet. Dominant planning practices only obscured the immersive worldviews, but all around water, if you like, but also enforced a limiting measure on the unruly landscape of the Delta. And so how to find a contemporary relevance for such a fluid dynamic? How to design for a situation like this? The image on the left is really a little north of Dhaka. If you move out, you will find this sort of beautiful corrugated landscape. On the right, a deltaic geography is an immense force of nature, and where floods and flows and overflows impart to this landscape this corrugation of flat plains, ponds, muddy enclaves, and lowlands, and which has constituted a topography of habitation and the occupation of that habitation or that landscape. And in that situation, landforms arise in an annual rhythm of unexpected waters, and which has then defined the condition of what is wet and dry. how Dhaka has been produced now. Massive landfill in which, very interestingly, these long pipes, as you can see on the top, and a map of the pipes on the right, across the wetlands, which is then filled up, often by these little barges carrying sand. If you look around Dhaka, if you ever go on the riverbanks, you will see these little notorious sand barges moving around. So Dhaka is being built from the fluid fabric of its surrounds, and yet wants to deny that. I'll overcome this, bypass this. So what I'll show now quickly are images of what we at Bengal Institute are trying to do, and that's been our focus. On the one hand, we are focused on the whole the question of the complex, the large ensemble, and also again at the other hand, the question of the large scale. By the large scale, I mean the city, the town, the landscape, the region. And quickly, what I will show, without going into too much detail, again, we are reimagining the riverbanks of Dhaka, as in this project from 2015. Close view. This condition does not exist, but this can happen. And also, we're doing some riverbank project. Again, trying to imagine a condition like this, but also this involves the fluctuation of water, which we're not showing here. Does involve that. And the other thing is working with such fluctuating conditions as wetlands or floodplains. So instead of pushing water away, again, Lewis Kahn's sketch becomes a point of departure for us. And again, so what you see on the right is a wetland. And so instead of filling up the wetlands and creating this sort of absurd plot-based developments and then push the water away, and water can be pushed away, it will return in one form or another. We are trying to develop this sort of bank of belt of housing around the wetlands. This is one example, and we have multiple examples that we're working with, and this is another one. This is supposed to be a little animated, right? It is. Wetland housing. Now, this is very schematic, but I'm taking this opportunity to share with you. This is what we're doing at the Bengal Institute. Another wetland type. Again, how to resolve this conflict that has arisen between policies that require wetness to be retained, but and then economic pressure, which pushes, bypasses those policies, and destroying these wetlands to create housing. Another model we're thinking of is cultural settlement, which involves retaining the farmlands, but then there are roads, maybe existing roads, how to actually develop housing on the roads. It's an idea, but something else can come out of. Again, the preciousness of land, how to retain that. Okay. And then lastly, working out of these various types that we're developing, we're thinking of a new city fabric that can happen. For Dhaka, I've argued that the core issue of Dhaka is not at the center, but at the edge. So the edge is the center of Dhaka, where all this, the politics of development is taking place. And we know this is another schematic idea of perhaps something that can happen as a city fabric. I end with this image. Again, Kabir, the architect, landscape architect that I'm in constant conversation with, he really sent me this image yesterday. And as you can see from the WhatsApp text that he sent me, I was, that's his dream, but it's a real thing. And what I was arguing, how can I take, and I dream of a city where the city can approximate a condition like this. So I've argued that Bangladesh is a theorem for ecological actions. And the ecology is largely a hydrological ecology. So with its aquatic and geological formation and flux, and this projected consequences of environmental changes, the organization of land, water, and settlements takes on an urgency that is unique to Bangladesh. And settlement patterns, architectural types, and socio-economic life world, they are all dynamically interconnected, and that confronts new accelerated economy and what have you, and that's the challenge. And this is what we do at Bengal Institute. We think that the architectural agenda needs to expand beyond form creation. The architectural task should extend its sights to the intellectual, ethical, and creative issues facing the futures of human habitats. The question of systematic and integrated landscapes, whether as habitats or place forms, agricultural fabrics, floodplains, or natural wetlands, should be at the center of new investigations and new imaginations, and actually form the core of a new design intelligence. And here I refer to what Rupali was saying about collective intelligence. So motivation for this new agenda is about place form rather than spectacular objects. And we hope and we desire and we dream, and we are working towards it, that a new orientation will uncover the original intimacy between architecture, habitation, and landscape that until now has remained disrupted. Thank you. So should I get out of the screen?
Yes, I think.
Or you can do that.
I think it's quite a.
Okay, yeah, right. Let's hold on to that image. If you,
I don't know if he takes it out. Does it expand the screen for him?
You both, I think, will be seen.
Okay. So maybe you can just stop sharing your screen. That will be easier because we can.
Yeah, it'll become in the conversation mode if you stop sharing. So it'll be nice if we can have the screen removed.
Oh, are you telling me to remove this?
Yeah, you can just
okay.
Sharing.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, that's nice.
Okay, great.
So yeah, thank you so much, Professor Ashraf. I think that was a brilliant presentation, and I mean, I really love the way you brought those two paintings, the Bangla Ragini and Islam's, paintings, which sort of speak about this idea of that there is no foreground and background, and this whole idea of this enmeshing of land, water, and life that sort of comes together, and that's really sort of the essence of, I think, not only Bangladesh but also I think the region. So in some ways it's a beautiful sort of proposition that you bring for us to think of the region through, and it's really interesting to start thinking of maybe new logics of working and new logics of living through these tropes that you sort of bring in, right? I mean, also in some ways, we speak about this idea that colonial architecture has really sort of spoken about the idea of resisting forces, right? And also the bungalow that somehow comes in, which becomes a trope of tropical architecture, also still has within it embedded this idea of resisting forces, right? And here we look at this land and that sort of in flux, this land and water that is in flux, and ways of sort of working with, the idea, new logics of working with this sort of land that perhaps is not so, that does not have that kind of fixity, So I think that's perhaps one of the challenges that we have to work with. But I think what actually also struck me was the three things that you brought in: this idea of water, this idea of life worlds, and the idea of the city. And I'm also thinking that kind of the exhibition in Seoul that you showed, this and this idea of the dichotomy between the wet and the land, and this idea of this kind of messy city. I'm still wondering, how does this messy city come into the picture? How do we, what are our new languages to deal with it, something that already exists? How does I'm still not able to reconcile this idea of the hydrological landscape with this idea of the messy city. So I don't know if there's something that one is sort of, thinking about in
Right.
those terms. So.
Right, right. Okay, no, that's a great question. Um, but if you compare the last image back to the last image, which seems to be a destination, but then in just a 30 minutes drive outside Dhaka, you will find this sort of situation. So this is not a dream situation. This is actually a real landscape condition. Of course, not to make too much picturesque sort of values out of it. There are social conditions that needs to be understood, analyzed, and critiqued. The social life of the farmer and the social life of the people living in rural areas, that needs to be brought into the equation. And it's a complex thing at the same time, that whether they want to stay on with that sort of condition or not, because the rural areas are drastically changing also. But something to advance with that image is the sort of the very coordinated ecological balance that happens in situations like that. Even if you are working in the farm, the irrigation, the water channel, the homesteads, they have for many years arrived at a condition of ecological balance, and whether one can not return to it, but that can be the basis for creating new conditions of cities and settlements. And many people around the world are working with that idea. But at the same time, yes, there is the messy city. The city exists, and the messy city is also a fantastic city. And Dhaka, beyond the kind of the anarchy that I mentioned, as in Mumbai or in Calcutta, we enjoy that sort of craziness of the city. That allows for another kind of dynamics and even creative productions or even livelihoods out of that messy situation. Can messiness be designed? That's something to discuss, and one can go back to perhaps Robert Venturi. He is the one perhaps who articulated that theoretically, in the architectural circle, at least, not quite in the urban context, but he did look at Las Vegas, and that's his model of messiness. How to embrace messiness in situations like this. I think one could develop that idea, not directly, but slowly from the life world situation. As Kabir and other architects have done, they're not going out there designing beautiful, disciplined sort of conditions. Let the people develop things on their own, and when it happens on their own, on the basis of certain spontaneity and conditions that are not foreseen now, you will end up in a situation that might be messy. So I think it's an interesting question you bring up, Rupali, and I'll think about it. I think perhaps life world, dense life world, and the aquatic condition can come together. But I think right now we are foregrounding trying to understand the aquatic condition as a foundation or a basis for large scale thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a longer question and it'll be wonderful.
Right. But I'm also thinking that with that Soul exhibition installation, we also realize that that by itself is something to think about and do about and extrapolate, analyze, and work on the messiness of the city. So we haven't yet done that with Dhaka in any major way, other than random images here and there.
Yeah. And I think the other sort of proposition, which is really interesting that you bring in, is the idea of the cluster, right? Like the idea of designing through the cluster.
Right.
One would also think the campus type. And I think that's something that, here we look at Louis Kahn sort of working with this idea of the landscape. And of course, Mazrul Islam sort of also working with this idea of the duality between the built and the landscape. But I'm also thinking of some of the precursors to what you have been calling the cluster or the campus, in terms of Kahn actually thinking of, learning from, say, the Fatehpur Sikri,
right.
as a campus type, as this idea of the cluster, to sort of, completely rethink this idea of modernism. right? Like the modern, which became, which was often looked at as cultural and almost like this new object for a brave new world. This idea of disaggregation, which a lot of architects then started working with, I think is an interesting thing to think about, and sort of start, looking at what the next trajectories of those would be. The idea of the cluster. So I think that's a very interesting formulation.
Right. I do see a question by one of the audience regarding this, and I think the person
I think that's what I
mentions.
have to take up now.
Yeah.
Yashita Joshi is asking, we have forgotten designing of complexes in regional context. And we have termed it master planning, where we are ignoring most of the times the design of built form, only concentrating on the master plan. Can you comment on this? Because most of these campuses end up looking like boxes which have no context.
Oh, that's a great question again. No, I have been thinking about, and we don't know what to call it. Yes, complex. And, that has a double meaning. It's a complex, and it has this complexity, right? And interestingly, Louis Kahn's complex was called the capital complex, and I've sometimes thought of it capital complexity, right? So a few things. Number one, going back to Kahn, yes, one could come and visit and see the buildings and appreciate its sort of magnificent form and spaces, what have you. But I think I would suggest for people looking at Kahn's buildings in Dhaka as well as in Ahmedabad, it's actually the whole ensemble. The other word is ensemble. How one thing relates to the other. So which is what a complex is about. It's relationships, it's connections. And when you do that, it's also about movement. It's not like an abstract thing. When you actually splinter things apart and then make an ensemble rather than a monolithic form, and sometimes you may have to do a monolithic form, sure, yeah, nothing to against monolithic form, but the moment you do an ensemble, which again Charles Correa was saying is ideal for a hot, dry, or hot in a hot places as Bangladesh and India, because then you can make these connections and you can go from place to place. In a monolithic form, going from place to place is constrained. But once you can do those sort of ensemble, then you can actually organize and create movements. You can design journeys, promenades, if you like, architectural promenade. And then you can have people who are doing those itineraries. They can experience degrees of enclosures. And again, with our climatic conditions, you can do various kinds of enclosures. You can do totally enclosed, and you can do semi to open to sky or half open to sky. And that gives the richness of the experience. With a master plan, the master plan is basically, we don't use the word master plan anymore, perhaps, in most contexts, because it doesn't arrive at this degrees of richness that such conditions a complex can evoke. And that needs to be, and that's what an architect can do, arrive at the richness of experience in a complex. And yes, Fatehpur Sikri is another great example. It's not, you pluck out one of those buildings on its own, yes, but it makes better sense, meaningful and experiential richness in the context of movement in the complex. So I have been lately really focused on this, and maybe I have done a few, not studios, workshops on this theme, the richness of complexes that we have historically, and also modernist architects as Mazharul Islam and Correa and Doshi and Anand Raja have already done, to look at them as complexes, not as, say, architectural elements here and there. And then there are beautiful examples from, say, Japan, which I follow very closely, the temple complexes, beautiful examples. Yes.
Okay, so the next question, Yashwant Pitkar is asking, is the work of Islam documented, and where can one see it, or any comprehensive on his work?
Right. Oh, great question again. One could start by some things that are available online. There is a Mazhar Islam archive, and you can get a quick sort of survey of his work. There are a couple of books. One that is about sort of his collection of his works, but that I wouldn't call it very extensive. I think we're still waiting for that to happen, and I'm kind of involved in that project myself. But I can suggest a couple of one book that I edited, Conversations with Mazhar Islam. It's called An Architect in Bangladesh, Conversations with Mazhar Islam. I think I have that here, right here, if I'm not mistaken. No, it's not here at this moment. An Architect in Bangladesh, yes, it is here. It's right under my laptops. So this book. Okay, so I conducted this conversation or interviews with him in 1993, and then this was published in 2012. So because to appreciate Mazhar Islam, it's not only about his architecture. He was deeply political figure, if you like, cultural activist, a teacher. One has to also listen to him. So I would, if you like, you can look for that book.
I think the question would be whether it's available.
Yeah.
Whatever, some other platform. Because
Right.
I think one thing that is
right.
for us to get books from South Asia.
That's right. I tell you, if you can't have easy access to books, where are you? Right. Yeah. So if anybody's interested, Rupali, if you can connect me to them, I'll see what can be done.
Yeah, definitely. We would definitely also be interested to see.
Right.
Okay. So the next question by Nirmal Kulkarni is, does Dhaka have to deal with rampant construction by the political builder nexus as in Mumbai, and can some comparisons be drawn to the floodings which occurred in the reclamation of land?
Yes, that's why I suggested we do a joint studio, Rupali, that we call it MUD, right? We have to deal with MUD, and MUD is Mumbai and Dhaka. There are major parallels between the two cities. And yes, the construction, well, I wouldn't call it construction, the so-called development is really rampant. But looking at Mumbai, I don't know where the developments are happening at this moment, but in Dhaka, the major development is happening around the fringes of the city, because the core city is already built up, and where it is built up, in the 80s, there were like 4 or 5 story buildings. They were torn down, and every building is now converted into a 10, 12, 14 story tower on a half-acre plot. And now you can imagine the pressure on the roads and the infrastructure. So that's the inner core city issue, which I'm not at this moment. I'm interested in that, and I've written about it, but I'm more interested in what's happening on the fringe, the so-called fringe. And the fringe is the center, as I was saying earlier. The edge is the center, because that's where the typically the so-called lowlands were or are. And interestingly, this is a term the English coined, lowlands. And it already gives a low value to the land, right? Lowlands. And price-wise, it's also low, but no land in Bangladesh is underutilized. No square inch. Either it's a paddy field, agricultural, or orchard, or if the water comes, there is fishing. So it becomes a floodplain, or it's a wetland, or it's a paddy field. And those are the lowlands. And then big developers somehow, they have a master plan. They have a master plan, the developers, how to kind of this, they descend on these areas and buys of these lands. And that's fine, developments will happen and then buildings will be built. But what they do is they basically fill it up by that whole sand filling operation. And that's also, the scale of the operation is incredible. Even the government doesn't have a scale, that's kind of a scale of operation, So which is another thing that has happened since the 80s in India as well as in Bangladesh, the clout of the developers, right? The might of the developers. So what they have done, and even the state is also involved. So they fill up this land, and then as if the water is pushed away, and then basically this, they make plots and they sell it off, So what? Yes, people have plots of land, but you have pushed away the ecological condition or the water, which will return. Every year it returns. Right now it's returning, Well, where will you push water away? And second, they create this sort of plot of land, which doesn't really create housing, something, Rupali, we haven't discussed, models of housing. Again, in India, beautiful examples from the 60s, 70s, even until the 80s. But right now, it's all about like development plots and apartments, but no really social community development of housing, which in this sort of model of development will not happen. So yes, similar.
So Damayanti Radheshwar is asking, what is anticipated to be the impact of sea level rise?
Again, tell me again, what is the impact of sea level rise? Okay. Yes, that's a trick question. Like, so am I to say, yes, there is sea level rise? No, there is sea level rise. There is no evidence, no. Well, we have to worry about sea level rise. There are coastal areas in Bangladesh, and I'm sure in India, which are being affected. And Bangladesh, the impact of sea level rise impacts livelihoods, as more areas are supposedly coming under seawater. Salinity is increasing, so that's an issue. How far will this encroach into the heartland of the country? These are all predictions and projections. We don't know. But I said that that's a reality. That's something to reckon with, and that also involves a new kind of infrastructural planning and settlement planning at the coastal level. And we are doing that a little bit, not that much, because it's a massive, immense problem. But at the same time, in Bangladesh, because it's a delta, we have this sort of huge deposit of silt that's going into the water. So what I'm saying is a complex problem. Yes, so at the same time, there are evidence of seawater rising or encroaching into the land, but at the same time, silt, clay, mud is coming into contact with this and creating a new kind of very complex land water situation. That's not something that's happening that's very different from what is happening internally in riverine conditions. So this is a coastal condition. And so this has not been mapped by anyone. We have only observed the condition. And that's another dynamic. So, right, yes. Sea level rise for definitely coastal areas, it's a complex issue, and we have to take it up also.
I think this is a related question, whether floating buildings will be the norm with sea level rise in Bangladesh. Yeah.
Well, right, formally trained architects are taking it on. Historically, people have done that on their own anyways, and now architects, and so this is now strategically a new area that architects are dealing with directly, whether as boats as buildings or buildings as floating, and I'm sure more and more of that will come up, not just in playful ways, but really responding to the life world of the people. And yes, well, floating structure historically, they either floating or really elevated, or floating but fixed. They're all kind of amphibious. They're all kind of models of architecture around water. And there are historically, even in the modern period, from Buckminster Fuller onwards, there are great models of floating architecture. But that's an area that architects will have to engage with. And we have actually a couple of architects, who are coming to Bengal Institute and talking or teaching about really architects looking at nautical architecture. This is something nautical architecture is something that other people did. Architects were not involved. Now there can be a new sort of communion between the two.
Yeah, I think that's a very point.
I'll mention this. Arijit Chatterjee and Asha Sumra, they may be listening. They were based in Mangalore, but those two are obsessed with nautical architecture. And they had been involved with us. They have come and taught. You can look them up. So examples like that, naughty architects like that will come up and help us understand nautical architecture. If they're listening, hello.
Okay. It's interesting, idea of amphibious architecture. I think
Right.
also the fact that we've had historical examples of those. Also interesting to think about. There's Anuradha Siddiqui speaks about is saying thank you for the presentation, especially to think more about the relationship of landscape as theory. Can you contextualize the cultural relationship of Dhaka urbanism to that of towns and cities elsewhere in the country? So I guess smaller cities
Yeah.
like
Right. Right.
are most
Hello, Anu.
trained in Dhaka, and is the academic culture centered there? Following that, are the urbanisms that build on alternatives to the capitalisms that have centered Dhaka producing relationships of to landscape that might help us think differently about architecture vis-a-vis smaller Bangladeshi cities and settlements?
Thank you. And so, hello to Anu. Thank you for listening. Now, that's also a very important point, and I don't think I mentioned that. In Bangladesh, in a very odd way compared to other places, not in India. I mean, in India there are various metropolitan centers. In Bangladesh, that's it, Dhaka. You don't know of anything else. Even within Bangladesh, you don't know anything else. But there are small towns of various sizes and scales. A couple of things are happening, sometimes in two different directions. One is most of these towns look up to Dhaka as a model. While Dhaka itself is, I wouldn't call it dystopic, but definitely anarchic. So they look up at Dhaka as a model, and that should stop. Or some other alternative should be found. On the other hand, we are working with a number of small towns or at the small town scale. And we have noticed that people there are not also interested in looking up at Dhaka. They want to find out what they have, to retain their own distinctive conditions, urbanistically, architecturally, and landscape-wise, and work with those. So you have like two models. Now, here architects have to get involved also, meaning it can't just be the metropolitan architect working for the biggest metropolis, the only single biggest metropolis, which is really defined by, yes, mainly by capitalist mode of progress, if you like. That needs to be resisted, challenged, and alternatives found, which we have shown with some examples. But yes, at the same time, it's a priority that architects work with small towns. Now, we are doing that also. We have identified that small town by itself is a whole new, complexes is one thing and small towns are another thing. And as in India also, I don't know, they're like, what, 500, 600 small towns of various scales, and they have their own energy, dynamic, and character, and modes. And one kind of needs to work with those rather than this sort of flying architect coming in and doing the same thing all over everywhere in the same similar way. So we are working with small towns, trying to understand, again, not in a master planning way, in an abstraction, but really to understand the texture, the nuances, the character of lives in small towns. And again, in a small country like Bangladesh, I had an idea that, all small towns are similar. They're not. You go to every small town, you find really distinctive characters. So we are working on that ourselves. And again, someone like Kabir, I mention him over and over again, and I end with his photograph. He was working in the city. He worked for a big university. He taught at a big university, but he just moved off and to a small town, Jinaida, where he's from, and he's operating from there. So that's one example, and there are a few other examples like that. So, right, bottom line is the small town is another sort of landscape on its own. That needs to be addressed before major damages are conducted there.
Yeah. Thank you. Salma Begum has listed a series of books on Mazrul Islam, including the one of yours, and also the fact that the Mazrul Islam archive has a lot of drawings which people can. Ekta Gyani is asking whether architects are also colonizers, of land and water, and who can really afford the cluster developments along wetlands, whether the common man can really afford it.
Well, I don't know. I don't have an easy answer to that, but whether architects are colonizers. Well, uh, as one of my friends, he's a German architect. He talks about, when we talk about sustainability, a good building is the one that has not been built yet, right? You know what I mean? Like the moment you build it, you're already into this sort of, the building has a footprint, it has its, carbon footprint, so on and so forth. It's already a problem. We ourselves, like, we have a footprint. But so neither can we disregard ourselves and neither can we disregard the aspect of buildings because we live through buildings. So to say that then architecture is a culprit in that manner, I don't think that will quite work. We have to then find out ways of working with, ecological ethics, as I call it. Who can afford to live, I think if the question was with wetlands, well, people are doing that. The developers are doing that. The developers are, as I was saying, filling it up and selling it off as plots. What I am arguing against is that model, the filling up and plotting. You can work with the formation of the landscape, if it is a wetland or floodplain or other kind of aquatic condition. You retain the ecological dynamic, but then you think of other models of development or housing or what have you that works with that flow, not a counter flow or just stop the flow or push the flow away. You work with the flow of things and you think of new models. Yes, we don't have examples like that in Bangladesh. We are working upstream, if I use an aquatic metaphor here. We are working upstream to work something out, but I think a new model has to be developed. That you can call it colonizing, but that's a proper colonizing than what is happening now. What is happening now is still colonizing, but that's at the damage to the ecology.
So Merve is asking, how should we think of, contextualize, define the idea of infrastructure in this kind of fluidity?
That's a good question. Well, anything beyond that, Rupali, or is that it?
Yeah, actually, there's just one Anand has placed in the chat. Actually, has Bangladesh in place any policies framework for resilient strategies in city planning and architecture, especially at the national regional scale? Maybe
I'll respond to the second one. Yes, there are laws and policies, both at the regional scale and in a localized urban scale. There are policies, what needs to be worked with in terms of the ecology, the landscape, the agricultural lands, and so on and so forth. And also at the urban scale, there are very well thought out plans and policies, good ones. But that's not working. People work around it, against it, and even if sometimes in a defiant way. And they have established models that may be contradictory to the policies, but then they become replicated. So that's what's happening. So with the argument that the policies that are in place, which are ecologically sensitive, if you like, hydrologically sensitive, will not allow economic development, or which really boils down to economic profit making. So that's the argument. So we need to do this. So that's where architects have failed, I argue. Architects are just, most architects are just waiting to receive the little plot on which they will make their buildings. That's where their scope has now devolved into. I think what needs to happen is that perhaps in a little way, what we're doing at the Bengal Institute is actually to make a mediation between these two, the ecologic and the economic, the loggerheads. whether a third alternative can be found where, sure, you can have development. We're not against development. I mean, the policies are there. The policy may seem like, we don't care about development. This is what it is. This is what stays. We're trying to figure out, as you have seen in the wetland housing, how new models of development can happen, again, with the conditions, the ecological and hydrological conditions at hand. So that's perhaps my response to the second question. The first question was about infrastructure, was it?
Yes.
Can you repeat the question again?
The question was, how do you think of contextualizing the idea of infrastructure in this kind of fluidity?
Right. A great question. Right. Now, yes, so architects have to, we are in the community of architects, I believe. And we really don't particularly deal with infrastructure or care about infrastructure. We let the infrastructure to happen, and then we arrive on our little plot of land. Well, we'll have to deal with infrastructure also. By infrastructure, it can mean roadways, embankments, bridges, all that. And this is something that we have also tackled. We did one major study of urban design for large-scale infrastructure, meaning roadways, for an international agency in Bangladesh. And this is interesting because international agencies are the funders of large-scale infrastructural projects, and I believe maybe in India, maybe not that much anymore, but in Bangladesh, yes. And they don't contextualize in line with the question with where the infrastructure is going through. Little, maybe some degree, but not quite much. You have a roadway like a 8-lane highway going down the road through paddy fields, through villages, through like a wetland, through a town. It really doesn't matter. They just draw the line. So it was interesting when that agency asked us to look at the urban design aspect, if I may call it that, of this infrastructure. So we really looked at how typically, and we looked at a specific roadway, and we analyzed, we categorized all the conditions that infrastructure will encounter, and we did prototypical designs for those encounters. So something that we have to do also. So the bottom line is that infrastructure, as I was mentioning, requires, if you like, urban design, landscape design, and even architectural design. For example, we are very much interested in embankment as the infrastructure. And in many small towns we are working with, in Bangladesh, all towns are on a river, next to a river, and there is an embankment. In Dhaka, the major issue is about an embankment. The western side has an embankment, the eastern side doesn't. You want an embankment, a kind of a regular kind of embankment, or another kind of embankment, or an embankment that's conducted in a new infrastructural model that engages settlement patterns, roadways, pedestrian spaces, and all that. So I think infrastructure, yes, needs to be looked at. That's another terrain, yes. Especially, right.
Yeah. I mean, that was the last question, and thank you so much for answering that. I think with that, we come to the end of this the talk, and I would really like to thank you for this. I think in South Asia, we have many questions, and it's wonderful that we've started to articulate this. Just to come back to what I was saying in the beginning, I think the contemporary is in flux, and I think we're standing on the shoulders of many people who have come in the past, who have articulated several questions, but the questions for the contemporary are actually much more complex than those, and I think it's wonderful that we are articulating more of those now. It's important for us to think collectively about these questions, and I think it's really important to start thinking of the region beyond the nationalistic boundaries, because I think that the answers are in that collective intelligence, as we spoke about. And I think I want to thank the participants for being here. I would also like to thank the faculty of C who's put this together, particularly Dipti, Anuj, Dushyant and Shreyank, who have been the kind of logistical support in putting this together, working tirelessly on this. The students of the school, also the Students' Council, who has, I think one thing that is important to speak about here is that the school is collectively run by the faculty and students. And I think that's a kind of model that we like to work with. Finally, I would like to thank the Urban Design Research Institute, which has been supporting this consistently, this effort. So thank you so much, and join us for the next talk, which is also from Bangladesh. Professor Ashraf spoke about Salahuddin's work. Salahuddin is going to be with us next week. So stay tuned. This is also on the Zoom link will be up on the website soon. And also on YouTube. This lecture is also going to be archived on YouTube. So thank you so much, Professor Ashraf. And I'm going to really take up your offer of the Mud and Sea Studio.
That's right.
Come back to you on that. Yeah.
Okay, great. Now, thank you so much, Rupali, and all your colleagues for organizing this, and also to all the viewers. And I think they were great questions and something that we might consider, step by step. And sure, the idea of the studio, which is more like a relationship between two cities than studio, and then continuing the conversation of a larger South Asian relationship. I think that's very important.
Absolutely.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.